Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we set sail under blood-orange skies and through gunpowder-scented fog to witness the downfall of history's most daring women of the sea. This is not the Disney version. There are no parrots reciting poetry or tidy endings. Tonight, we follow the rattle of chains and the creak of wooden decks to a moment where it all unravels, the moment of capture. They're fierce, brash and brilliant. They wield cutlasses and command respect in an age that barely admitted their existence. But when the sails of the King's Navy catch the wind, and the noose begins to tighten, what really happens to female pirates? You'll want to know, but just a cheeky warning, they probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love imagining us all scattered across the world, sailing through this together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with a shattering crack of cannon fire. The year is 1720, and the Caribbean sun beats down like it knows something wicked is ending. A British sloop has cornered a ragged pirate schooner off the coast of Jamaica. Smoke pours from both vessels as splintered wood, and shouting voices fill the salt-heavy air. On board the schooner, two women fight with the fury of cornered lions. One in a man's coat, long auburn hair whipping like a flag of defiance. The other, more compact, precise, each shot fired a punctuation mark in the chaos. Anne Bonny and Mary Read. The names that will be whispered for centuries. But today they're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. When the dust clears, their captain, Calico Jack Rackham, is already surrendered. Most of the crew are either dead or groaning on the blood-slick deck. Anne and Mary, breathless and bruised, are hauled up in chains. Their hands are bound, but their glares remain unshackled. It is here, in this moment of capture, that the mythos of female pirates takes a sudden, bone-cracking turn. We imagine freedom and fire, but what followed was far from glory. Captured pirates were not exactly afforded due process. The laws governing piracy were harsh, designed more as deterrents than pathways to justice. For women, things got stranger. The very fact of their piracy confounded the legal system. In many cases, courts were so unsure how to proceed with trying women for high seas crimes that they treated them as anomalies, either with morbid fascination or outright disbelief. Anne and Mary were marched ashore under heavy guard, their bare feet slapping against the cobbled streets of Spanish Town. The trial wasn't long, nor was it fair. Most trials for pirates at the time resembled theatre more than justice. Witnesses were paraded, evidence minimal, and judgments often preordained. In the gallery the public jostled to see the female pirates, less outlaws than spectacles. Women? On a ship? With weapons? They muttered, some in admiration, others in dismay. The idea that women could commit the same violent acts as men, especially under the guise of masculinity, upset the delicate social fabric of the day. One of the judges later wrote that he couldn't decide if he was more disturbed by their crimes or by the way Anne Bonny sat, legs apart, eyes unwavering, smiling. And what were the punishments? In most cases, capital, hanging at gallows point, a slow shuffle up the steps, a rope knotted by someone who had tied too many. But here's where it gets interesting, because Anne and Mary didn't hang. Not right away. They invoked a rarely used plea known as pleading the belly, a claim of pregnancy. Under English law, it was illegal to execute a pregnant woman, so the court was forced to delay. They summoned a jury of matrons, local women tasked with verifying the pregnancy. Both pirates were found to be quick with child. Historians still argue whether these pregnancies were real, fabricated, or the result of prison assaults. Either way, it bought them time, but that's not how it went for everyone. Take Rachel Wall, often cited as America's first female pirate. Captured in Boston decades later, she wasn't given the luxury of delay. Her crimes weren't even fully at sea. She lured victims from the shore, then robbed them. When she was caught, her trial was quick, and the outcome grimmer. She was hanged at 29. Her final words included a request for prayers and a reminder that she never killed anyone. Didn't matter. There's also Fanny Campbell, who sailed disguised as a man. Her capture is debated. Some say she escaped altogether, reinvented as a merchant's wife. Others claim she was quietly executed, name erased to keep future women from getting ideas. You'll notice a pattern. Those who were caught faced a system unsure of what to do with them. Were they monsters? Were they mentally ill? Or were they simply women who dared to be something else? The British Admiralty, in its cold, bureaucratic way, recorded names, crimes, and fates. But the commentary around female pirates always carried extra weight. Descriptions of their scandalous dress, masculine courage, or unnatural rage. A woman in trousers, with a blade, that terrified more people than cannonballs ever did. Now, let's look at a quirky little story from the records. In 1685, a female pirate named Martha Farley was captured off the coast of Bermuda. She refused to speak for 3 days, prompting rumours that she was a mute or possessed. The local clergyman was called in to perform an exorcism before she finally, calmly asked for a cup of tea and confessed to everything. She claimed she joined the crew after falling in love with a fellow pirate, and that she'd only ever killed in defence. Her sentence was commuted to indentured servitude in Virginia. The sentence wasn't kindness, it was convenience. The colony needed labour more than it needed another hanging. And then there are the ones we'll never name. In fragmented letters and ship manifests there are references to a woman among the condemned, or a female sailor of unknown origin. They vanish between the lines, history's ink not bothering to preserve them. One curious debate among scholars involves a potential all-female pirate crew off Madagascar, described in 1702 by a Dutch merchant as ghost women of the Straits. No evidence has ever been confirmed. Most dismiss it as sailors' gossip, but some argue a handful of pirate ships may have operated with women captains who avoided the major ports entirely, thriving just beyond written history. Still, for those who were caught, whose stories were preserved by courts, Gawkers, or government, the road after capture was mostly bleak. There's a haunting document from 1721 describing a mass execution in Kingston. Among the men listed is Jane D. Nothing else, no age, no crime, just Jane, swinging in the Caribbean sun. But not all ended on the rope. Some female pirates negotiated. When captured, they offered up names, maps, or caches of stolen goods in exchange for leniency. These deals were double-edged swords. Informants were often shunned, even hunted by fellow pirates, and if the Crown didn't get what it wanted, mercy was revoked in an instant. Still, the sheer fact that women tried, and sometimes succeeded, in negotiating their survival adds another layer of complexity to this history. So what happened to Anne Bonny and Mary Read? Mary died in prison not long after her conviction, likely of fever, perhaps childbirth. The prison was damp, overcrowded, and riddled with disease. Her body was never claimed. There is no grave. Anne, well, that's the mystery. She disappears from the record. One theory suggests her wealthy father pulled strings, securing her release and marrying her off quietly. Another believes she escaped, rejoining a pirate crew under a new name. A fringe theory claims she lived to old age, running a tavern in Cuba where she told stories no one believed. Whatever the truth, her vanishing act remains one of piracy's greatest unsolved endings, and so the crashing waves close over this chapter. The ship is seized, the sword dropped, the woman chained, and the world moves on, too eager to forget that some of its fiercest rebels once wore corsets under their cutlasses. They called her Wild, but Wild doesn't quite cover it. Anne Bonny, daughter of a disgraced Irish lawyer and a maid, was fire distilled into flesh. From the beginning, she was a troublemaker, setting fire to her father's plantation in Carolina after an argument, refusing to marry the suitors he chose, and ultimately vanishing into the Caribbean winds with a pirate named James Bonny. But domestic life never suited her. She wasn't meant to cook stews or sew linen. She was meant to shout commands across a wind-whipped deck, flanked by men who feared her more than they fancied her. So when she met the flamboyant calico Jack Rackham, with his dyed clothes and even brighter dreams, it was inevitable. She joined his crew, some say in disguise, others claim it was obvious from the start. What matters is this: she didn't just survive among pirates, she thrived. Her aim was deadly, her voice sharper than any blade, and her reputation spread faster than scurvy. And yet all stories like hers eventually collide with empire. The Royal Navy didn't care how daring Anne Bonny was. By 1720 they'd had enough of piracy. They hunted crews across the Caribbean with ruthless precision. When they caught Rackham's ship off Negril, Anne fought like hell. But once captured, She was chained and dragged to Spanish Town with the rest. Her trial, shared with Mary Read, was more public spectacle than judiciary process. At trial, Anne refused to beg. While Rackham wept and pleaded, she stared straight ahead, jaw set. When asked about her actions, she reportedly replied, "If he'd fought like a man, he needn't be hanged like a dog." It was more than a barb. It was a eulogy for Rackham and a manifesto for herself. Still, she was convicted. Death by hanging, same as the others. Then came the twist. She claimed to be pregnant. As you know, this was a delay tactic well known to women accused of capital crimes. English law held that a pregnant woman could not be executed until after the child was born and weaned. Some historians argue Anne actually was pregnant with Rackham's child. Others believe it was a bluff she learned from Mary. What followed is a fog of guesses and fragmented letters. She was transferred to prison, where Mary would eventually die. But Anne, she slipped into the cracks of history. A few years later, a record appears in Charleston, a woman named Anne Bonny marrying a local tradesman. Another rumour places her in Cuba, running a quiet inn where her left hand always twitched toward an invisible sword. No grave bears her name. No official pardon was signed. She simply vanished. The mystery of Anne Bonny's final fate haunts historians. Did her wealthy father use connections to buy her freedom? Did she change her name and bury her past? Or did she slip back to sea, too cunning to be caught again? We may never know. What we do know is that she became something more than a pirate. She became a ghost in the archives, an open question trailing behind the gallows. There's something peculiar about how history treats women like Anne. Male pirates are immortalised as romantic rogues or brutish villains. Female pirates, by contrast, become symbols. Anne Bonny is the rebellious daughter, the warrior lover, the avenging fury in breeches and boots. She is everything society told women not to be, and that's precisely why she endures. Of course, with fame comes fabrication. In the 19th century, writers began crafting florid accounts of Anne Bonny's life. They painted her as a swashbuckling temptress, sword in one hand and pistol in the other, often exaggerating her femininity to titillate Victorian audiences. One particularly imaginative pamphlet claimed she wore silk beneath her leather and once seduced an entire Spanish garrison to escape capture. None of it is verifiable, but it lingers. Even today, search her name and you'll find tattoos, novels and TV characters loosely based on the shadow she left behind. But beneath the embellishment there remains a core of real visceral courage. Anne Bonny was a pirate not because she sought fame or gold, though she certainly liked both, but because the world offered her no place she could exist freely. At sea, among cutthroats and cannon fire, she found a kind of grim equality. That equality, however, vanished the moment she was chained. Colonial society didn't quite know what to do with captured female pirates. In the taverns and broadsheets they were either vilified or mythologized. But in legal documents they were conundrums. Courts had no standard procedure for prosecuting women as pirates. In many cases, female outlaws were treated more as aberrations, moral failings or freaks, than as criminals. This uncertainty often worked against them. Without precedent, judges leaned heavily on religious and patriarchal values. Female pirates were sometimes portrayed as possessed or accused of being unnatural women, a phrase that echoed through sermons and sentencing papers alike. One record from a Barbados trial states, "She bore the manner and speech of a man, but the treachery of a harlot." Translation: she dressed like a man and refused to act like a lady, therefore she deserved to hang. Ironically, the same toughness that kept Anne alive at sea became evidence against her in court. Her refusal to show remorse was used as proof of moral depravity. Her courage, so lauded among her peers, became a liability. If she had cried, if she had begged, perhaps her sentence would have seemed more palatable to the judges. Instead, she smiled. One clerk wrote that she seemed unbothered by death, as if she might dodge it yet. Perhaps she did. But not everyone around her was so fortunate. Rackham was hanged soon after the trial. His body was tarred and gibbeted, left to rot in an iron cage at a public crossroads as a warning. The sun melted his skin. Birds pecked his eyes. It was the Crown's version of closure. Mary Read, as we mentioned, died in prison. The exact cause is unclear: fever, childbirth, despair. Her body was buried in a simple, unmarked grave behind the jail. The name on the death record reads, Mary Read, Pirate. Anne's name does not appear there, not on the graves, not on the pardon rolls, not even in the records of those hanged. And that silence speaks volumes. One possibility is that Anne was released into obscurity. A few whispering accounts suggest she was quietly shipped back to Carolina and placed under house arrest. Others hint she may have been ransomed by a sympathetic relative. Still others think she may have bribed a guard and escaped. Whatever the case, her story doesn't end with a drop in a rope. It ends with a question mark, and that may be the most pirate thing about her. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Anne Bonny wasn't the only female pirate of her time, but she was one of the few whose tale survived. Why? Because she challenged the expectations of gender so thoroughly that the world couldn't stop talking about her. She was like a glitch in the matrix of colonial society, a woman who refused to be quiet, compliant, or invisible. In the years following her trial, newspapers, pamphlets, and tavern songs carried her legend across the seas, and as they did, her image changed. Some made her a villain, others a hero. But the truth? That's buried somewhere in the hot Caribbean soil, or adrift on the waves she once ruled. One final oddity before we close this chapter. In a dusty ship's log discovered in the 1950s, a Dutch sailor describes stopping at a small island near Haiti in 1742. There, he writes, they were welcomed by an elderly woman with a pistol at her belt and a red scarf around her head. She spoke fluent English, smoked a long pipe, and knew the names of every pirate ship that had sailed the Caribbean 2 decades earlier. Her name, Miss Anne. Most historians dismiss this as a sailor's yarn, but wouldn't it be just like her? To cheat the hangman, slip the bars, and disappear behind a puff of tobacco smoke, watching from the shore as the world forgot the rules she once burned. The cell is damp, that bone-deep kind of damp that seeps into your joints and never quite leaves. It smells of rust, mildew, and old regrets. Iron bars streaked with salt. The flicker of a tallow candle plays shadow puppets on the uneven stone walls. Mary Read sits against the wall, her back straight. Her eyes not quite fixed on anything, but also not vacant. She's thinking, always thinking. The trial is over, the sentence is passed. She and Anne Bonny have both pleaded the belly, claiming to be pregnant. It's the only legal tool they have left. For now, it buys them time. Not much, but some. Mary knows the rules. She's spent her entire life knowing exactly what was permitted and how to tiptoe around it with a sword in hand. Her story begins far from the Caribbean. Mary was born in England, likely around 1685, the illegitimate daughter of a widow who disguised Mary as her deceased older brother in order to continue receiving financial support from her in-laws. In short, Mary grew up wearing breeches, not bonnets. She learned to ride, fight, and curse before she ever learned to sew. And in that strange twist of misfortune, she found something like freedom. She served for a time in the British military, still disguised as a man. One account says she fought in the War of the Spanish Succession, serving with honour and hiding her identity with such care that even her comrades were fooled. She fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed her secret and married him. But fate, always greedy, took him too soon. He died and she drifted again. Eventually she boarded a ship headed to the West Indies. When that ship was taken by pirates, Mary was offered the choice, die or join them. She chose the latter. Some say that's when she met Anne Bonny. Others suggest they were already crewmates before either knew the other's secret. What's certain is this. They recognised each other, not just as fellow women, but as kindred spirits, cut from the same jagged cloth. Mary was a natural with a cutlass. She fought not with brute force, but with calculated precision. Her movements were graceful, almost surgical. On one occasion, when another pirate questioned her courage, she challenged him to a duel and killed him at dawn. That act, bizarrely, raised her status among the crew. She wasn't just tolerated, she was feared, respected. But now, in this jail, all of that fades. Titles, kills, victories, they count for nothing inside 4 stone walls. The cell is cold even in the tropical heat. Illness creeps through the prison like a slow tide. Dysentery, fever, despair. Mary is sick. Whether from the child growing inside her or the rot of the place, no one is sure. Even the jailers, usually indifferent, keep their distance. She doesn't whimper, doesn't plead. Her pride is stitched into every breath she takes. Still, her strength wanes. She writes no letters, leaves no final confession. Her end comes quietly. One morning, when the guard arrives with the usual slop of porridge, she doesn't stir. Her body is cold. Her eyes are closed. Mary Red dies in that prison, likely in early 1721. She is buried in unconsecrated ground, a simple patch behind the jail. Her name, when recorded, is written small, almost like an afterthought. And yet, her life echoes. Long after she was buried, sailors would tell of the woman who bested men with a blade, who loved and loved again, who died not for being a pirate, but for being a woman who refused to be lesser. Historians still argue whether Mary Red ever truly wanted to be known. Some claim she sought obscurity, that her disguises were more than necessity, they were shields. Others suggest she longed to be seen as she was, complex, fierce, contradictory. A woman who could lead a boarding party and cry in the dark. The truth? We'll never know, and perhaps she preferred it that way. What we do know is this. Mary's life was a testament to the strange spaces women could carve for themselves when the world gave them none, and yet in death, even her identity remains debated. One theory posits that Mary and Anne were lovers, another suggests they were rivals. A third, perhaps the most mundane, imagines them simply as allies, two women caught in a maelstrom of choices no man could understand. After her death, something odd happened. Records of her vanished from colonial discussion. While Anne Bonny continued to appear in broadsheets and ballads, Mary faded. It was as though she embarrassed the empire more than the others, not because she killed, but because she didn't apologise. She didn't weep at the gallows. She didn't grovel. She died quietly, on her own terms. And what of the child? There's no record of a baby born to Mary in that prison. It's possible she miscarried, or that the infant, born into disease and despair, never survived long enough to be documented. Or maybe the child was taken, adopted out, its heritage buried to avoid scandal. We don't know. There is, however, a tantalising fragment from a Kingston midwife's notebook, dated shortly after Mary's death. Tended a birth from the prison, mother passed, child sent to the parish. No name, no details, just a whisper. A maybe, imagine that, a child of Mary Read, raised in the shadows of empire. Maybe he, or she, grew up never knowing the truth. Or maybe, years later, the child stood at the edge of the sea, staring at the horizon and wondering why the waves felt like home. Now pause with that thought, because Mary Red's story, for all its fire and fight, ends not with a bang but a quiet exhale. No last words etched in stone, no ballads sung, just a woman who chose the sword over the needle and lived like thunder for as long as the sky allowed. But let's not let her fade. There's a quirk in the historical record that resurfaces every so often. A merchant captain writing in his log about a duel witnessed in a Havana port. A woman with a limp and a scar who drank like a sailor and cursed like one too. An old prisoner in Port Royal muttering stories of the red-haired killer and her quiet shadow. They never use names, but the shapes of the legends remain. And in those flickers of memory, Mary Red lives on. If nothing else, her story reminds us that rebellion isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act of survival, of claiming space in a world that insists you shouldn't exist, of walking into a courtroom in breeches and daring them to hang you, and of dying without regret. They stand there, side by side in chains, the salt from the sea still crusted in their hair. The trial is over, but the theatre is far from finished. For Anne Bonny and Mary Red, pleading the belly bought time, but not certainty. Now the question is no longer what they did, but what should be done with them. This was the strange grey zone that female pirates occupied in the legal world. Once the splash of cannon fire and stolen gold subsided, once the handcuffs clicked into place, they were no longer outlaws. They were puzzles. Dangerous, certainly, but also perplexing. Not just criminals, but contradictions. The courts weren't just condemning theft or mutiny. They were judging a kind of heresy. Women acting like men, and better at it too. Legally speaking, piracy was treason. To rise up against the flag of England, especially on the high seas, was to spit in the face of the crown. For men, that meant the full weight of execution, hanging, gibbeting, and eternal dishonour. For women, the situation required improvisation. Take the case of Charlotte de Berry, allegedly a pirate captain in the 1600s. Her story is most likely fabricated, written into pulp tales a century later, but the themes ring true. In the myth, she dresses as a man, serves in the navy, leads a mutiny, and eventually commands her own ship. Her fate? She's captured and forced into marriage by a tyrannical governor, then lost at sea. The details may be fantasy, but the message isn't. When women crossed the line into male-coded violence, society responded by shoving them back, into marriages, into prisons, into graves. The law had no consistent precedent for women pirates. In some cases, they were tried as accessories to male crime, despite leading crews or participating fully. In others, they were accused of witchcraft, insubordination, or unnatural conduct. The statutes stretched to fit the discomfort of the judges. Historians still argue whether these erratic legal outcomes reflected a desire to protect women or simply a panic at the idea of losing control over them. In the records from the 17th and 18th centuries, you'll find language that drips with moral anxiety. Court scribes often commented not just on the crimes, but on the behaviour, posture, and appearance of women on trial. When Mary Red stood without weeping, the transcript noted her mannish firmness. When Anne Bonny smirked at the magistrate, one clerk wrote that she bore herself with the insolence of a sailor, and none of the grace of her sex. One Jamaican judge lamented, "What hope for the sanctity of law, when women wield cutlasses with pride?" There's even a note from a trial in Nassau where a female pirate's testimony was cut short, not for lack of relevance, but because the judge deemed her tone indecent. She had dared to speak like a man. That was worse than theft. Yet some women, paradoxically, benefited from these biases. If a woman could appear sufficiently feminine, remorseful, domestic, delicate, she might be spared the noose. There are cases of female pirates who, though clearly guilty, were sentenced to lesser punishments. House arrest, exile, even bizarrely marriage to colonial officers, because nothing said rehabilitation like becoming someone's wife. One infamous example, a pirate named Anne Dieu le veut, Anne God wills it. A French woman said to have duelled a male pirate to win his ship. She fought alongside him for years. When they were captured, he was executed. She was not. The reason? The governor of Tortuga found her too charming to kill. She was later reportedly married off and retired from piracy. A cruel joke, really. Men were killed for being pirates. Women were often punished for being interesting, but not all women on trial conformed to these expectations. Some, like Anne Bonny, leaned into their fierceness. They refused to cry, refused to grovel. And the courts didn't know what to do with them. Their very presence was disruptive. They defied categorization. They weren't innocent girls. They weren't mad women. They weren't witches, though the term was thrown around more than once. So the law bent, and often it cracked. One chilling example comes from Bridgetown, Barbados, where a pirate named Grace Thomas was sentenced to trialless isolation. She was neither hanged nor pardoned. Instead, she was locked in a cell for 17 years, no visitors, no trial, just silence. Her only crime? Refusing to identify the location of her buried treasure. Rumour said she died whispering names of ships into the dark. Legal scholars refer to her case as a judicial anomaly, which is a nice way of saying they didn't know what to do with a woman who wouldn't obey. This unease extended to the public as well. Executions were public spectacles, meant to deter crime and entertain crowds. But hanging a woman, especially one who didn't seem sorry, unsettled the audience. It forced people to confront uncomfortable questions. Could women be evil without being insane? Could they choose violence not as a defence but as a profession? The moralists said no. They explained female piracy as a corruption, usually by a man, a fatherless upbringing, a seducing captain, a fall from grace, anything to preserve the idea that real women didn't do such things on their own. But Anne and Mary, they did. They weren't lured. They weren't coerced. They chose the sea. They chose the sword. And that made them dangerous in ways the law couldn't quite articulate. One judge, exasperated during sentencing, reportedly muttered, "They are more trouble than any 10 men." And he wasn't wrong. It's worth noting that in many of these cases the sentence wasn't just about death. It was about erasure, names scrubbed from plaques, records buried or rewritten. The very idea of a female pirate posed a threat to colonial order, not because of what she stole, but because of what she represented. The possibility that gender roles weren't fixed. That strength, cunning, and rebellion weren't the sole property of men. This fear even extended to literature. In early 18th century pirate biographies, those grand collections of villainy and bravado, female pirates were often included as cautionary tales. They dressed as men, and look what happened to them. Yet readers weren't always scared. Some were inspired. One young English girl reportedly tried to stow away on a merchant ship, dressed in trousers and carrying a wooden pistol. When caught, she said she wanted to be the next Anne Bonny. So the stories persisted. Not in official documents, but in whispers, in song, in stories told around the hearth or under decks in the dead of night. Even now, historians comb through court transcripts, letters, and logs trying to piece together what truly happened to these women. But the records are incomplete, redacted, burned, misfiled, deliberately erased. The law, after all, is a creature of precedent. And female pirates were inconvenient anomalies, easier to pretend they never existed. But the sea remembers. It remembers the bootfuls of women who walked decks with a gun on each hip. It remembers the laughter during storms, the defiant shouts from behind cannons, the quiet songs hummed while patching sails. It remembers, even when the courts do not. And so, every time we return to these trial documents, every time we peer at the cramped handwriting of colonial clerks, we're not just reading history, we're listening to ghosts. Some were hanged, some were spared. All were judged not just for their crimes, but for daring to redefine what a woman could be. The courtroom hushes, but the murmurs echo through every corridor, an echo that won't die down. Not yet. There's too much to unpack. A woman in a tri-cornered hat with powder burns on her knuckles. A woman found guilty not just of theft and violence, but of sailing under false gender. The room has seen pirates. It has hanged them. But these women, they disturb the script. When the magistrates gather their notes, puff their wigs, and pretend neutrality, their discomfort is palpable. They lean on old statutes written by older men, built for a world of tidy distinctions. Man or woman, sailor or homemaker, predator or prey. Female pirates don't just break the law, they make it break itself trying to catch up. It's a peculiar irony that women who lived disguised as men often had to undress their identities to defend themselves. The courtroom demanded truth, but not their truth. It wanted apologies, confessions, tears. And if it got instead a steady gaze and a clenched jaw, well, that was a different kind of crime altogether. The legal gymnastics required to convict women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were not small. English common law had centuries of experience with rebellious men, highwaymen, mutineers, heretics. But women weren't supposed to rebel at all. So when they did, it triggered not only punishment, but a full-blown identity crisis for the system. Let's put this in context. In 1718, King George I offered the king's pardon to any pirate who surrendered. This was a strategic move to pacify the Caribbean and reclaim colonial control. Hundreds of pirates accepted, hanging up their cutlasses in exchange for freedom and in some cases even land. But the pardon was nuanced. It applied only to those who surrendered within a certain window, and it assumed the pirates were men. The documentation, writs, oaths and letters makes no mention of women. What would the king have done with a woman in breeches and boots swearing allegiance? Invite her to court? One woman tried. In 1721, a pirate named Prudence Howell petitioned for clemency, citing the king's pardon. The local governor rejected her claim, citing her improper conduct for a lady. Her crew was executed. Prudence? She was sold into indentured servitude in Barbados, a lifetime of labour under the sun. The records show her whipped twice for insolence. Then, nothing. Her name simply vanishes. Again the pattern. When the law can't quite categorise a woman, it tries to erase her. Another case, Maria Cobham, a fierce and elusive pirate caught near Trinidad, was tried not as a pirate, but as a thief. Why? Because the law couldn't agree on whether women could legally be defined as pirates at all, unless they had an official rank on a ship, which of course they were never officially given. This legal loophole became a weapon. Women were sometimes downgraded to accomplices, regardless of their leadership roles. Others were labelled stowaways or prostitutes in disguise, even when evidence showed they commanded crews or engaged directly in battle. The law wasn't blind, it was willfully myopic. And the worst part, for many of these women, it wasn't the trial itself that sealed their fate. It was the testimony of those around them. Crew members, desperate for lighter sentences, often betrayed their female comrades. She disguised herself as a man. She goaded us into mutiny. She was the most bloodthirsty among us, and courts, hungry for confirmation bias, ate it up. Still, despite the odds, a few remarkable women managed to twist the system to their favour. Some manipulated expectations by performing femininity. One trial in 1709 describes a woman named Eleanor Smith, accused of piracy, showing up to court in a dress she reportedly fashioned from sailcloth and lace. She wept. She quoted scripture. She claimed she was kidnapped and forced aboard. The judges acquitted her. A week later, she was caught attempting to steal a merchant ship in the same harbour. Was it deception? Survival? Performance art? Historians debate her intentions, but either way, Eleanor Smith walked free. Twice. Other women used marriage as a shield. Colonial law offered protection to wives of pirates if they could prove they were unaware of their husbands' crimes. Some savvy pirates married just before surrendering, giving their partners an alibi. One woman, Abigail Curtis, married her captain mere hours before capture. She claimed he had lied to her. The court believed her. The captain was hanged. Abigail opened a tavern in Port Royal 6 months later, called the Widow's Anchor. But let's not romanticize. For every Eleanor or Abigail, dozens more were condemned in silence. The archive is littered with unnamed women, a female stowaway, a whore in sailor's garb, the woman with the powder burn. These were women the court didn't deem worthy of full documentation, but they existed. Their stories whispered through the margins. A particularly haunting example comes from a logbook recovered from a Royal Navy vessel. In it, a young officer describes transporting pirates to a trial in Kingston. Among the prisoners was a woman he refers to only as the Red One. He writes, "She stared at me like I'd stolen something from her. I think I had. We don't know what happened to her. The trial records don't mention a red-haired woman that week. Perhaps she died en route. Perhaps she was tried under another name. Or perhaps somehow she escaped." And still, behind all this legal confusion lurked a single, uncomfortable fact. Many of these women were better pirates than the men they sailed with. They had to be. To survive aboard a ship full of hardened criminals as a woman, often disguised, often outnumbered, required brilliance, ruthlessness, adaptability. These were not damsels who stumbled into piracy. These were tacticians, fighters, leaders. The courtrooms may have tried to strip them of that identity, but the sea never did. Which leads us to an even thornier issue. What did it mean to dress and live as a man in an era where gender roles were not just social, but legal frameworks? For Anne and Mary, it was both camouflage and empowerment. Disguise was survival, but also liberation. Wearing men's clothes meant freedom of movement, less suspicion, and fewer questions. It also meant respect in a world that viewed women's opinions as ornamental. The court saw this cross-dressing not just as deception, but as defiance. There's a line in a 1721 trial transcript that reads, "She wore breeches without shame and cursed like the worst of them." It wasn't just the theft or the violence that angered the judges, it was the lack of apology for transgressing femininity. And yet these women didn't see themselves as masquerading. For them, the sea was the honest world. It asked only one thing: could you do the job? Could you pull your weight, fire your gun, and hold your nerve when the waves turned black? That brutal simplicity was perhaps more just than anything the courts ever offered. Of course, this didn't stop the authorities from trying to reframe their narratives. After executions, captured women's names were often posthumously dragged through the mud. Pamphlets described them as lustful fiends, mad women, or witches. In death, they were rewritten to better fit the script, one where rebellion must always be punished and forgotten. But not all were forgotten. Anne Bonny remained a legend. Mary Read, a mystery. Others, like Fanny Campbell or Grace Thomas, flickered in and out of folklore, their stories surviving in tavern songs and bedtime warnings. And the law? It eventually adapted. Slowly. Painfully. It began to acknowledge that women could in fact commit serious crimes of their own volition. But that shift came long after the pirates were gone. For the women of the Golden Age, the law was a cage too small to hold the lives they dared to live. So the next time you picture a pirate on trial, imagine not just a man in chains, but a woman with salt in her hair, soot on her cheek, and a smirk that says, "You don't know the half of it." Because the court may have condemned her, But history is still catching up. The courtroom echoes are fading now, replaced by the muffled whispers of a different kind of plea, one murmured between clenched teeth and rising pain. "I plead my belly." Not a cry of innocence, not even a denial. It's a statement of biological fact, and yet it carries with it the weight of life and death. In the early 18th century, for a condemned woman, this phrase could be the thinnest sliver of hope. Pleading the belly wasn't just legal jargon. It was a loophole carved into the harsh stone of English law. If a woman sentenced to die could prove she was pregnant, the court was required to delay her execution until after the child was born and safely weaned. In practice, it was often a reprieve, though never a guarantee. And for female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Red, it was their last card to play. But the process? Far from humane. Once the plea was issued, the court summoned what they called a jury of matrons. This sounds gentler than it was. The jury was usually composed of local women, often midwives or wives of officials, tasked with physically examining the accused to determine whether she was quick with child. Not just pregnant, mind you. The term quickening referred to the point at which fetal movement could be felt, typically around the 4th or 5th month. If no movement was detected, the plea could be dismissed. There were no ultrasounds, no blood tests, just hands on skin, guesswork, and the occasional muttered prayer. And yet, despite its crudeness, the process often worked. Whether out of superstition, compassion, or discomfort with executing a visibly pregnant woman, many courts hesitated. The gallows could wait. Of course, some women took advantage of this. There are documented cases of female criminals faking pregnancies to delay execution. Some stuffed fabric under their gowns. Others starved themselves to mimic morning sickness. Still others may have genuinely believed they were pregnant. Hope and desperation can blur reality. For pirates, the plea was both shield and sword. Anne Bonny's case is a famous example. When she stood in court, found guilty of piracy and sentenced to death, she didn't cry or collapse. She simply invoked her condition. The court paused. She was examined, found to be quick with child, and so the sentence was postponed. What happened next remains the stuff of legend. Did Anne give birth in prison? Was she ransomed by a relative or wealthy benefactor? Did she escape? We may never know. But one thing is certain. The belly plea gave her time, and for a pirate, time was everything. But it wasn't just about survival. There was something deeply ironic about using the most traditional symbol of womanhood, pregnancy, as a defence for the most untraditional life imaginable. A woman who had defied every norm, dressed as a man, led raids, fired pistols, now invoking her womb as her last lifeline. Historians still debate the ethics of the plea. Was it manipulation, or a reclaiming of bodily autonomy in a system built to ignore women's agency? The answer, perhaps, is both. In a world where women were seen as property, their reproductive ability often defined their value. Courts were more reluctant to destroy what they saw as potential life than to acknowledge the humanity of the mother. The baby was innocent. The mother? Debatable. This led to strange inconsistencies. In some colonies, a woman could be executed after childbirth without ever seeing her child again. In others, she might be kept alive until the child turned one, then quietly disappear from the records. Occasionally, infants born to convicted pirates were placed in poorhouses or orphanages, raised by the state without names, without lineage. One grim story from Port Royal involves a baby born to a pirate mother who was hanged just 3 weeks later. The child, a girl, was named Hope by the nuns who took her in. Hope died at age 5 of a fever. No last name, no burial marker. Another child, possibly Mary Reed's, was quietly adopted by a merchant family. There's a record of a boy named Thomas Reed, age 6, sailing with his uncle to Charleston. Some believe he was Mary's son. Others call it coincidence. The paper trail ends at sea, and sometimes the plea failed outright. Judges had discretion. If they believed the pregnancy was faked, or if the crime was especially violent, the plea could be rejected. One record from 1703 describes a woman, guilty of piracy and multiple murders, found with child, yet executed anyway. The gallows master noted in his log, "Her belly moved not. Her eyes moved too much. Cold comfort. colder justice, but not every plea was cynical. Some women were truly pregnant, and their pleas became moments of raw humanity inside an otherwise brutal system. A particularly strange case involves a woman named Clara Moffat, captured with a pirate crew off the coast of Antigua. She was visibly pregnant and gave birth while awaiting trial. The court delayed sentencing. Her child, a boy, died 3 days later. When they returned to execute her, she sang to the noose. Her lullaby was reportedly overheard by townspeople half a mile away. This image, of a mother-turned-pirate singing as she ascends the scaffold, haunted colonial imaginations, not because of the crime, but because it forced them to see her as a person. The belly plea wasn't just a legal manoeuvre, it was a rupture. A small, tender crack in a wall built of hangings and proclamations. It reminded everyone, just briefly, that the pirate before them had a pulse, a story, a womb, and perhaps a reason. And for the women who made that plea, it was sometimes the first time their bodies gave them power instead of vulnerability. The sea had demanded masculinity, toughness, silence, strength. But here, in a courtroom scented with ink and fear, femininity became a weapon. That said, it's a double-edged blade. The same plea that delayed a hanging could also brand a woman as fallen, a mother without marriage, a seductress, a temptress. Judges scrawled moral judgments in the margins of sentencing papers. One wrote, "The wench claims a child, she claims nothing of shame." Because that was the unspoken expectation. If a woman invoked her pregnancy to delay death, she had better weep. She had better appear penitent, broken. She had better play the part of the tragic Eve, sinned and sorry. But Anne Bonny didn't weep. Mary Red didn't apologise. Others followed their example, silent, proud, unrattled. This dissonance infuriated the courts. A woman on trial was supposed to be a morality play, a cautionary tale. But these pirates didn't deliver the appropriate script. And so, the system stalled. It hesitated. It bought time, for them, and unintentionally, for history. Because each delay, each unsure verdict, each second glance at the belly plea was a reminder. The system couldn't fully contain these women. Not in court, not in prison, not even in myth. The plea became a pivot point, a crack in the gavel's echo, a moment where the unstoppable machine of justice paused and blinked. It's worth noting that no male pirate ever had such an escape route. They had the sword, the bribe, or the gallows. But women? They had one last trick, and yet it wasn't always enough. Because in the end, pregnancy could delay the sentence, but it couldn't erase it. For some, the noose merely waited until the cradle was empty. For others, the plea led to quieter fates, hidden lives, secret children, years spent under assumed names. Occasionally, a survivor's name would surface again, on a marriage license, a property deed, a death record. But more often they disappeared, just as the courts preferred, just as history feared. Because a woman who survived by pleading the belly was more than a legal footnote. She was proof that the rules weren't absolute, that even in the tightest noose there was sometimes room to breathe, and in that breath, in that brief delay, an entire world could change course. The chains are cold, but the choices are colder. Outside the prison gates the world still spins with order. Tea poured, horses shoed, sermons droned over yawning crowds. Inside, however, a different negotiation begins, one that the courts rarely document, and history often shrugs past. What happens when a woman, captured at sea with blood on her boots, is given two impossible options, the gallows or a governor's parlour? It's not as rare as it sounds. Throughout the Caribbean and colonial ports beyond, there exists a curious undercurrent in the records of female pirate trials. In some cases, the final judgment didn't swing from the noose, but settled instead into something stranger, a life in limbo, caught between punishment and performance. These women weren't hanged, they were absorbed. Rehabilitated, the governors might have claimed, but in truth it was closer to repurposing. Let's back up a bit. After a trial, when a female pirate was found guilty but still deemed redeemable by virtue of her gender, beauty, youth, or perceived influence, she might be offered a different path, a quieter sentence. Not to the gallows, but into domesticity, into marriage, into servitude, into someone else's story. Picture it. A notorious pirate captured with swords and smoke still fresh on her skin, suddenly made to serve tea at a colonial governor's banquet. A few guests know who she is. Fewer speak of it. She becomes a curiosity, a cautionary tale that can refill your glass and remove your plate. All while the memory of raids, plunder and pistol smoke still flickers in her eyes. Anne Dieu le Veut, once feared as a pirate queen in the Caribbean, is said to have been one such case. After capture, rather than being executed, she reportedly became the guest of a French official on Tortuga. Some records describe her as a housekeeper, others as a companion. Some go further and suggest she became his wife. Historians still debate whether this was an act of survival, a forced arrangement, or something in between. But what's undeniable is this: she never returned to sea. Another woman, Lucia La Tigra Morales, captured after an ambush on a Dutch convoy, was spared execution on condition that she marry a local merchant whose son had died in the same raid. The arrangement, presented as reconciliation, was in truth a political theatre. She went from commanding men with flintlocks to serving them at dinner. Her voice, once loud and sharp with authority, became soft and measured. Or so the papers claimed. These conversions from outlaw to ornament were seen by colonial authorities as victories, restorations of social order. A woman in breeches was dangerous. A woman in petticoats, tamed, civilized. But how voluntary were these new lives? That question haunts the margins of every surviving record. There are few first-hand accounts, no journals or memoirs, just faded mentions in church records, guest lists and gossip letters. We do know this. The women who took the path away from execution rarely spoke publicly again. They slipped into roles, into manners, into domestic stillness. Their legends stopped at the front porch of propriety, yet whispers persisted. A tavern in Nassau reportedly employed a serving girl who'd once sailed with pirates. She bore a small tattoo of a ship behind her ear and walked with a sailor's gait. Guests who recognised her never said her name aloud, but they knew, and some claimed she would still, in drunken moments, hum sea shanties that hadn't been sung in years. Then there's the tale of the widow pirate, a woman taken into the home of a magistrate after her capture. She worked there for years. One morning she vanished. No note, no trace, just gone. The guard said she walked off toward the docks. Some claimed she boarded a ship dressed as a boy. Others said she walked into the water and never returned. Fact? Legend? At this point the two blur beautifully. What's clearer is that the choice between the gallows and the drawing room was no choice at all. It was transformation, or better yet, translation. These women had to become new versions of themselves. Acceptable, quiet, domesticated. They had to swap pistols for parasols. But can you really scrub the sea from your bones? That's the question one broadsheet posed in 1734, reviewing the trial of a woman named Elizabeth Raleigh, accused of piracy, and later pardoned on account of good conduct and marriage to a man of standing. A year later, she was arrested again, this time for drunkenly threatening a constable with a broken tankard and shouting about "the fools who think a ring dulls a blade." Not exactly a model housewife. Still, the pattern repeated. Offer them mercy if they behave. Spare their necks if they bow their heads. In a bizarrely theatrical twist, some governors even used captured female pirates as cautionary trophies. They'd parade them at social events, dressed, powdered and silent, to remind the public of justice served. One governor's wife wrote in a letter, "She sat 2 chairs away from me, hands folded. But oh, her eyes! They could sink ships." That sense of danger never quite left. Even under lace and civility, these women carried something volatile, unruly, uncontainable. A life lived at sea cannot be fully erased by soap or silk, and yet many tried. A fringe account tells of a woman named Sarah Black Bennett, once the feared captain of the brig Foxjaw, who ended her days as a midwife in Charleston. She delivered babies by day, but by night, according to neighbourhood children, she sharpened a cutlass in the basement and spoke to ghosts. A myth? Probably, but fitting. The transformation of pirates into wives or servants was not always tragic. For some, it was escape. For others, peace. And yet, even in those quieter lives, the tension remained. The friction between who they had been and who they were made to become. One contemporary playwright even tried to capture this in a now-lost tragedy titled The Corsair's Wife, where the main character, a former pirate, sits nightly at her window, watching ships depart, fingers twitching at every sail. Because once you've tasted the sea, how do you go back? This uneasy resolution, neither dead nor free, defined the post-capture lives of many female pirates. They weren't martyrs, they weren't villains, they were ghost stories in waiting, living warnings, symbols of something unspoken. And though some managed to carve small corners of contentment, gardens, families, maybe even joy, the shadow of the noose never really left. It hung over every dinner invitation, every sermon, every night they sat up remembering waves and wind and blood. And then, there's the strangest part. Some of these women became local legends not because they were feared, but because they were missed. A fishing village in Barbados held an annual festival well into the 1800s where they honoured the woman who stole the sea, a reference to a pirate said to have once protected them from slavers. Whether true or not, the sentiment endured. She was their pirate, their ghost, their rebellion. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all. Not gallows, not drawing rooms, but memory. Memory, messy and unfinished, clinging like salt air to everything they left behind. The tide has gone out on the famous names, Anne Bonny, Mary Read. Their stories still shimmer on the surface, like glints of broken glass in a tide pool, visible, dangerous, even beautiful. But what of the others? The forgotten few? The female pirates whose names are buried under rot-stained court records, or not recorded at all? The ones who didn't make it into ballads or tavern tales, but who sailed, fought, and died just the same? They existed. We know because the ledgers and manifests, though often reluctant, admit it. Somewhere on a ship's roster, scrawled in cramped handwriting, you might find a woman aboard, name unknown. Or a prison entry, female pirate taken with 6 men, uncooperative. They flicker in the margins, in the footnotes, always described in relation to men. Never as full actors, never as captains, rarely even as crew. But they were there. Take Jeanne de Clisson, a name barely muttered in English records but whispered with awe in French ports. She lived in the 1300s, not technically in the golden age of piracy, but her vengeance set the tone. After her noble husband was executed by the French crown for treason, Jeanne outfitted a fleet of black ships and began attacking French vessels exclusively. She was known as the Lioness of Brittany. She spared no one. Some accounts claim she executed prisoners with her own blade, smiling. Eventually she disappeared into England's courts, protected by politics and time. Jeanne wasn't forgotten in Brittany, but to English-speaking historians she became a curiosity, then a footnote, then a ghost. Centuries later, the same erasure continued. There's the case of Maria Lindsay, whose name appears only once in a Jamaican prisoner log from 1712. Maria, female, charged with piracy. Foreign tongue, no confession, awaiting disposition. And that's it. No follow-up, no trial records, no sentence. She vanishes as quickly as she appeared. Was she executed? Deported? Sold? Did she die in that prison without a word from anyone? Or did she escape? The silence is louder than any sentence. And yet, sometimes, an unexpected voice breaks through. In a brittle letter dated 1704, a colonial secretary complains of a woman named Abigail Blackwell, accustomed to wear breeches, smoke a pipe, and speak to sailors as their better. She was reportedly arrested 3 times, always released, and finally boarded a ship to Madagascar, never to be seen again. Whether that was exile or escape depends on how you read it. But Abigail too was a pirate. By posture, by occupation, by sheer refusal to be anything else. What makes these stories so slippery is how easily they were overwritten. Court clerks often misrecorded names, translators distorted accents. Women disguised as men were tried under male aliases, their gender sometimes only discovered posthumously, if at all. In one macabre instance, a corpse pulled from a wrecked pirate vessel off the coast of Tortuga was found to be female only after burial. Her effects, cutlass, boots, a pistol engraved with initials, were auctioned off. The coroner's record reads simply, "Unidentified sailor, fair hair, of unusual dress." A later retelling by a local fisherman turned her into a local legend, La Sirena de Sangre, the blood siren. Fact, fiction, something in between? Historians still argue whether she ever lived, but maybe that's the point. These women straddled the line between record and rumour so effectively that even now we struggle to categorise them, and maybe that's why they remain invisible. Piracy, as a historical subject, has long been romanticised. Peg legs, treasure maps, parrots. The pop culture version of a pirate is a man, a rogue, sometimes charming, often brutal. A woman in that role disrupts the fantasy. She complicates the narrative, makes it harder to pretend the sea was ever ruled by just one kind of outlaw. Even modern archives struggle to hold space for these figures. Visit a maritime museum, and you might see a dress behind glass labelled as belonging to a pirate's mistress. But rarely do you see the cutlass beside it, labelled, wielded by a woman who took 3 ships and made port before sunrise. And yet, those women lived. They swore oaths under moonlight, loaded pistols with shaking hands, buried treasure in places they'd never return to. They climbed masts with the wind ripping at their sleeves. They were seasick. They were fearless. They were there. It's easy to think that if someone mattered, they'd be remembered. But history has always been more sieve than vault. The stories that pass through depend not on truth, but on timing, on who wrote them down, on who decided they were worth the ink. In 1725, a sailor wrote in his journal about a wild-eyed woman aboard a sloop near St. Kitts. She drank rum straight, cursed in 3 languages, and shot at sharks for sport. I'd not cross her for all the sugar in Jamaica, he wrote. Her name? Couldn't catch it over the storm, that's the last we hear of her. It's tempting to fill in the blanks. To name her. To build a life from that one scribbled line. But that risks fiction. And these women deserve more than myth. They deserve acknowledgement. Even in silence they mattered. Take the group of unnamed women found in the ruins of a pirate encampment on the Mosquito Coast. The bodies, uncovered centuries later, were wearing fragments of trousers, belts made for weapons, and one had a ring carved with the image of a kraken, an unusual symbol, often associated with death defiance. Anthropologists remain unsure whether these were pirates, captives, or something else entirely. But the positioning of the remains, buried with care, side by side, suggests something deeper. A bond. A crew. Not all pirate women were leaders. Not all were legends. But even those who served as part of a crew, scrubbing decks, cooking meals, loading muskets, did so at a time when the very act of being at sea as a woman was considered unnatural. There's power in that. In the small acts of defiance that don't make headlines. Like the woman who signed on as a cabin boy, carried messages between ships, and lit every cannon that cracked a merchant hull. No name survives, just a payroll line. Cabin aid. Unusual height. There's speculation that many more women sailed than records admit. Scholars now believe some ships had 2 or 3 female sailors aboard at any given time, often undiscovered until much later. The bodies were there, the records weren't. And then there are the pirates whose stories have been deliberately obscured. One odd legal case from Bermuda references a female crew of brigands detained for thievery. Their sentence sealed by order of the governor. Why sealed? The theories range from scandal to highborn lineage to simple embarrassment. Whatever the reason, the record was locked away. Literally. Today the pages faded, the names smudged. All that remains is the faint outline of their presence. They sailed, they fought, they were captured, they were forgotten, but not entirely. Somewhere in the sea air their stories linger. You feel them in the hush between waves, in the sudden gust that flips a page, in the gap between a historian's footnote and the truth. The forgotten few may never grace museum plaques or Hollywood scripts, but they are the backbone of the legend. Without them, piracy is just half a story, a tale of loud men and louder cannons, missing the whispers that carried just as much rebellion. So tonight, let's raise a toast to the ones without names. The ones who climbed rigging by moonlight, who smuggled secrets in their sleeves, who disappeared before anyone thought to ask what they'd seen. They weren't famous. They were something better. They were free. There's something about betrayal that lingers longer than blood. A gunshot ends quickly, a sword thrust leaves a scar. But betrayal? That seeps in like brine into wood, warping the planks of trust until the whole ship groans under its weight. And when it comes from within the tight-knit, rum-soaked brotherhood, or sisterhood of piracy, it hits differently. Most think of pirates as lawless, bound only by greed and instinct, but in truth, pirate crews operated with a kind of code. Articles were signed, shares were agreed upon. Loyalty wasn't just a virtue, it was currency, which made turning informant not just dangerous, but downright blasphemous. Yet when the gallows loomed and the hangman polished his rope, some pirates, men and women alike, sang like parrots with a mouthful of gold. The idea of a female pirate turning crown informant was both rare and risky. Not only did she have to betray her crew, but she also had to convince her captors that she was worth sparing. This was a delicate dance. One misstep, and the noose tightened anyway. One of the most chilling cases involves a woman named Lydia James, captured off the coast of St. Lucia in 1719. Lydia wasn't a captain. She wasn't even first mate. She was the quartermaster's scribe, responsible for keeping records of plunder and provisions, a pirate accountant, if you will. When their sloop was overtaken, Lydia offered the British Navy something better than her silence. She handed over a full inventory of recent raids, complete with dates, ship names, and notes on who took what. The authorities were stunned. Her document was so precise, so damning, that within 2 months, 5 other pirates were captured and hanged based on her notes alone. And Lydia, she vanished. No execution, no transport papers. Just one letter from a customs officer in Antigua noting that Mistress James has been granted safe passage northward under a new identity. A few years later, a widow by the name of Eleanor King opened a counting house in Boston. Some believe they were the same woman. Her books, it's said, never had a single miscalculation. Not all informants were so lucky. Grace Thomas, mentioned earlier as a long-time prisoner, was offered clemency in exchange for testimony. She refused, then accepted, then changed her story mid-trial. The authorities deemed her unreliable and hanged her anyway. Her body was left on public display for 3 days. The message? Betrayal might spare your life, but only if you play the game just right. Still, for some women, becoming an informant wasn't about survival. It was revenge. There's the case of Catalina Mercer, a fierce woman known for her duels and hot temper. Captured in Havana in 1732, she volunteered damning evidence against her former captain, whom she accused of assault and theft. She claimed he had promised her a share of the treasure, but cheated her out of it, and worse, had beaten her when she protested. Her testimony was theatrical, vivid. She described raids in detail, named names, and even drew maps from memory. She cried on the stand, laughed bitterly, spat when his sentence was read. He was hanged. She was not. Instead, she was shipped to a convent in Seville. Part punishment, part exile. There she reportedly lasted only 6 months before escaping through a laundry chute. Some say she fled to Morocco. Others think she returned to piracy under a new name, with a ship painted red at the waterline, so the sea won't show the blood, she supposedly said. Historians argue whether Catalina's story is true or embellished, but records confirm at least one woman by that name stood trial and testified in Havana, and the gaps, well, that's where the legend breathes. Not all betrayals were clear-cut, though. Sometimes the line between informant and survivor blurred. A woman might share information under duress, or offer it incrementally, always trying to gauge what it might cost. If a crew member was dead or already captured, was it truly betrayal to name them? If she revealed the location of a buried stash, was that a sin or a smart investment? One chilling letter from a colonial scribe describes a woman of notable cunning who gave up 2 of her crew and was later found attempting to poison a guard with nutmeg and lime. No name is given, just that phrase, notable cunning, which feels equal parts awe and fear. There's even a fringe theory that Anne Bonny herself may have collaborated with authorities after Mary Read's death. It's based on a set of letters discovered in a private archive, allegedly written by a naval officer who mentions, "AB proved useful, provided details of Spanish supply routes, may warrant conditional release." The authenticity of the letters is hotly debated. Some call them forgeries, others see them as a missing puzzle piece. If Anne did trade information for her life, it would explain her mysterious disappearance from public record. But it also muddies her legend. Would it make her less of a pirate, or simply more human? The betrayal narrative is complex. Female pirates weren't just rebels, they were survivors. And when survival meant navigating both shipmates and sovereigns, Loyalty often came second to self-preservation. Still, the price was steep. Informants, once revealed, became pariahs. They were hunted, ostracised, sometimes killed by their former comrades. Even those who escaped the noose often lived the rest of their lives under assumed names, always glancing over their shoulders. A curious example comes from a London newspaper clipping in 1745, describing a woman arrested for pickpocketing. She gave her name as Mrs. Raven. The officer noted she had a tattoo of crossed swords on her forearm, unusual for a lady. In custody, she reportedly confessed to having once sailed the Caribbean in darker days and had made enemies whose shadows stretch farther than most ropes. Was she an informant, or just a pirate who lived too long? We'll never know. What we do know is that betrayal, like piracy, has its own code, unwritten, unforgiving, especially for women whose very presence aboard a ship was already considered treacherous by society's standards. In the end, the spyglass and the branding iron served the same master: control. The authorities wanted names, maps, gold, and they would extract it however they could, through coercion, confession, or compromise. For the women who cooperated, there was no guarantee of safety, only a different kind of danger, a quieter gallows, and for the ones who didn't, silence was their final stand. Sometimes the bravest act wasn't firing a pistol, it was keeping a secret even as the rope creaked. The heat clings like wet wool to everything: skin, air, breath. It oozes into the narrow corridors of the prison, into the chipped iron bars and cracked bowls of grey porridge. This is not some romantic pirate hideaway with rum and hammocks. This is colonial incarceration, and it is built to crush. In the prisons of Barbados and Kingston, Port Royal and Tortuga, female pirates didn't face an exotic fate. They faced confinement designed for men, operated by systems that barely acknowledged women could even be criminals, let alone pirates. Picture it: stone walls sweating salt, rats the size of tankards slinking through shadows, one slop bucket, no beds, a single air shaft choked with mould. Prisoners chained together not by crime, but by proximity. And into this, a woman, maybe two, still bruised from battle, still tasting gunpowder, still defiant. What could possibly go wrong? To begin with, the infrastructure was never designed for women. These were jails built for sailors, merchants, thieves, men who fought, bled and bargained. When women landed inside, jailers often didn't know what to do with them. Some were thrown in with the general population. Others were locked away in solitary. A few, especially if pregnant, were sent to makeshift infirmaries that were little more than stables with straw. The sensory overload was relentless. Mildew-stained ceilings, the constant moan of prisoners, and a metallic stench of rust and urine. Add to that the tropical rot that turned food into mush and water into disease, and the prison itself became a slow executioner. In 1721, an official from Bridgetown wrote of the local jail, "The female prisoner has gone mad. She talks to the stones and eats her own hair. No name is given, no follow-up, just another body in the inventory." And yet, despite the squalor, these prisons were still stages, places where society played out its shame, fears and hypocrisies. Female pirates were more than just inmates. They were attractions. Jailers charged coins for a peek through the bars. Come see the wench who wore boots, the lady corsair. Tourists from England would scribble in travel journals about the foul-mouthed woman in shackles or the red-haired devil who swore like a soldier. One pamphlet, sold on the streets of Kingston, included a crude sketch of a woman chained to the wall, dagger clenched between her teeth. Whether it was accurate didn't matter, it sold copies. That commodification of criminal women was not unique to piracy, but in these prisons it took on a strange theatre. They were both feared and ogled, demeaned and mythologized, and always, always watched. Women in these jails were under near constant scrutiny, not just for security but for spectacle. A woman eating with her hands, savage. A woman refusing to pray, witch. A woman lifting her head when a guard entered, insubordinate. Every action was a performance with consequences. Privacy didn't exist. Not for bathing, not for bodily functions, not for grief. And yet some women carved out spaces, brief sanctuaries where rebellion still flickered. One tale from 1708 describes a female pirate who braided her hair with copper wire, allegedly to strangle a guard during his rounds. Whether she succeeded is unclear, but the cell block was shut down for a week. The guards spoke in whispers. A week later she was moved. To where? No one knows. Another story, half legend, half guess, speaks of a woman who sang every morning, even as her health failed. She sang sea shanties backward, it's said, to confuse the devils. Her fellow prisoners began humming along. When she died, they scratched the lyrics into the walls with bones. Of course, the prison system wasn't just filth and folklore. It was also bureaucracy. There were ration lists, punishment logs, ledgers of executions. In those records, female names are rare but unmistakable. Margaret T., sentenced to die, currently in irons. Hannah Black, awaiting inquiry. B.W., female, foreign, detained. The descriptions often reduce them to body parts. Young, scarred, of coarse feature. It's dehumanizing by design. But every so often a guard would scribble something more. Spoke 4 languages. Could recite verses from memory. Wrote her name in the wall with blood. One particularly haunting entry reads, "She smiled when the chains came off, as though she missed them." There were moments of twisted kindness too. Some jailers offered lighter duties, sweeping, sewing, mending, in exchange for silence. Others traded food for stories. "Tell us about the treasure," they'd say, about the ghost ship, about the knife fight in Martinique. If the woman complied, she might earn an extra biscuit. If she didn't, well, biscuits weren't the only thing withheld. Sexual violence, though often hidden in records, was a grim undercurrent in these prisons. Women, especially pirates seen as unruly, were often targets. Their resistance made them vulnerable. And colonial authorities looked the other way. After all, what mercy did a woman deserve who had boarded ships and spilled blood? But even under such duress, some refused to break. A report from 1716 describes a jailer resigning after repeated failure to subdue the temperament of the prisoner. The woman in question allegedly broke his nose with a chain. He quit the next day. She was moved, again, to solitary. That same cell still stands today, in ruins, but intact. Tour guides call it the Pirate Queen's Tomb. No plaque, no bones, just walls that remember. Despite the grim conditions, prisons were also strange microcosms of pirate life. Some female prisoners formed alliances, bartered for news, passed messages through grates and slop buckets. They carved secret symbols, ship silhouettes, crossed pistols into the stone. When the hangings came, they watched from inside. They counted steps, memorized names, kept score. One woman, according to a chaplain's journal, refused her last rites. "The sea baptized me," she said. "The rope will finish the sermon." Not all died inside. A rare few were released, due to pregnancy, bribery, or changes in law. But even those who walked free bore the prison with them. The damage, both seen and not, clung like wet clothes. Many couldn't return to normal life. They were too marked, too remembered. Some ended up back on the docks begging. Others found work as servants under assumed names. One woman was reportedly employed in the very home of the judge who sentenced her crew. She polished his boots while he drank wine and spoke of justice. Others, remarkably, disappeared. Gone from the ledgers, gone from the courts, gone from the sea. Did they die in the jungle, join another crew, and hide inland under a husband's name? Perhaps all three. And yet the prisons remember. They echo. The creak of a chain, the scratch of fingernails carving a name, the last laugh of a woman who never begged. Behind those walls the myth becomes real, not because it's pretty, but because it endured. The sea never gives back what it takes, but sometimes it lets you slip away unnoticed. For a rare few female pirates, capture was not the end. The gallows never came. The prison doors swung open or were quietly bypassed. And just like that, these women disappeared, not into death, but into disguise. Reinvention was the final act of piracy, the ultimate escape, and for those cunning enough to weave new identities from the frayed remnants of the old, freedom didn't mean a pardon. It meant vanishing in plain sight. Take the elusive tale of Cecilia Seal Eyes Marsh. Captured in 1723 off the coast of Tortola, she was imprisoned for only 3 days before she simply vanished. Guards claimed she bribed them. Others whispered she seduced the warden and sailed away under his name. What's known is this. A few months later, a merchant named Charles Marsh began frequenting ports from Nassau to Charleston, shipping goods under a new flag. He walked with a limp, smoked constantly, and had the coldest blue eyes anyone ever saw. Years later, after a hurricane destroyed part of Charleston's harbour, bones were found in Marsh's home, clearly female. The legend had been true all along. This was not an isolated tale. A woman captured near Havana in 1702 was tried under the name John Redding. When her disguise unravelled, the court hesitated. She wasn't a known pirate. No charges stuck. She was released. 6 months later, a pamphlet in Port Royal claimed she'd rejoined her old crew under a new alias, Red-haired Jane. No one ever caught her again. Disguise for these women wasn't just clever clothing or a short haircut, it was transformation. It meant learning to walk with new rhythms, speak with new inflections, borrow mannerisms like stolen coats. In an age where records were patchy and memory unreliable, it was possible, if dangerous, to become someone else entirely. Especially if you were willing to kill your old name. One of the most audacious reinventions comes from a woman known in the records only as Margaret L. Captured with a crew off Trinidad, she was interrogated for days but revealed nothing. Her trial ended in confusion. She spoke 4 languages, gave contradictory statements, and eventually feigned madness. The court dismissed her as unstable and placed her in the care of a local physician. 3 years later, a man named Lars Duquesne emerged in Martinique, trading tobacco and arms. Wealthy, quiet, elusive. Years passed. Then one night, during a fire in the port, Duquesne saved a child from a burning house. In the process, a sailor noticed a tattoo on her shoulder, a serpent biting its tail. The same mark had been described in Margaret's prison record. The sailor told no one until years later. By then, Lars was dead. Buried in fine clothes with a heavy chest of coin and 3 children, none of whom had ever heard the word pirate. Sometimes reinvention was simpler. Some women shaved their heads, adopted new names and boarded merchant ships. Others went inland, vanishing into plantations or towns where no one asked too many questions. In some cases it was easier for them to pose as widows than as men. A woman alone, wrapped in grief, could move through colonial society with relative ease. No one wanted to know the details. The veil of mourning offered a kind of invisibility. One such case involved a woman called Mistress Collins, who appeared in Port Elizabeth claiming to be the widow of a lost captain. She ran a small tavern for 10 years. One night during a drunken brawl, she knocked out a sailor twice her size with a pewter tankard. When the constable arrived, she was calm, composed, and armed. Inside her pantry, authorities found flintlock pistols, stolen navigational charts, and a ring that once belonged to a famous privateer. They arrested her, but no one could prove her identity. She claimed it all belonged to her late husband. Without a confession, she was released. The next day, the tavern was empty. She'd vanished again. Historians still argue whether Mistress Collins was one of Anne Bonny's aliases. The dates match. The attitude certainly does. But of course, not every escape involved disguise. Some women simply bribed their way out of trouble. Piracy, for all its brutal drama, often collided with mundane corruption. A handful of coins here, a favour there, and the noose could be replaced with a whisper. In a letter dated 1717, a customs officer writes, "The female rogue we caught last week is gone. Her cell was unlocked at dawn. Nothing stolen, no sign of force. Her scent lingered like cloves." Cloves were often used by women to mask body odour, particularly those pretending to be men. Other women used their charm not to escape, but to convince those around them that they never needed escape to begin with. Some sweet-talked their way into safe passage. Others offered information about rival crews, then disappeared before the authorities realised they'd been fed lies. There are multiple instances where women turned up years later, not as criminals, but as respectable merchants, innkeepers, or even school teachers. A record from Boston in 1731 lists a Miss Eleanor Vane as opening a girls' academy. A surviving student journal describes her as terribly strict, with eyes like thunderclouds. One day, a drunken sailor passed by and shouted, "You're the storm, aren't you?" Miss Vane didn't flinch. She closed the shutters, dismissed class early, and was never seen again. Even the legends admit, not all pirates die with swords in their hands. Some die in beds, surrounded by flowers and lies. The ability to vanish was a skill most men never mastered. They left trails, bravado, boasting, tattoos, drunken confessions. But women were practiced at invisibility long before they picked up a pistol. Society had trained them for it, and when they learned to harness that invisibility, twisting it into camouflage, they became ghosts. Not the haunted kind, the clever kind. The kind that slips out the back door with a wink and a map no one else can read. Still, reinvention came with a cost. To start over meant burying comrades, identities, even memories. Some women chose solitude, living in shacks on the outskirts of towns, only ever seen at dawn. Others left clues. A familiar tune hummed to a child, a tricorn hat hidden under floorboards, a tattoo that peeked out in summer. Some couldn't take it. One woman, believed to be a former pirate named Sarah Roon, reportedly confessed everything on her deathbed to a parish priest. She gave details of ships sunk, raids executed, treasures buried. The priest, aghast, recorded it all, then burned the paper. "I asked God what to do with a pirate who had lived as a wife," he wrote. "He said nothing." In that silence, the truth remains. Escape was possible, reinvention attainable. But it wasn't easy. It was a second life built atop a haunted one, and for those women who managed it, every morning brought a quiet triumph. Not the loud kind with cannons and coins, the quiet kind. The kind that starts with the simple act of waking up, free. Dust gathers slowly on myth, but once it settles, it can shape the way history breathes. For decades after the last known female pirates disappeared into prison records and whispered rumours, the world seemed content to forget them. The sea kept its secrets, the courts sealed their files, and the world, with its teacups and revolutions, moved on. But in the 19th century, something curious happened. The age of empires gave way to the age of archives. Libraries bloomed. Scholars, antiquarians, and amateur historians began to dig. Not into gold-filled caves, but into the brittle, ink-blotted bones of the past. And tucked in between maps and manifests, beneath layers of naval reports and colonial journals, they began to notice anomalies. Women on ships, women in trials, women over and over, in trousers and shackles and headlines long erased. At first, these mentions were met with scepticism. Victorian sensibilities recoiled at the idea. Pirates were meant to be men, brash, filthy, maybe one-eyed and unshaven, but unquestionably masculine. A woman aboard was a passenger, a witch or a victim. But one of them, a corsair, unthinkable. So the early scholars, confronted with the undeniable evidence of female pirates, tried to explain it away. In an 1843 lecture to the Royal Historical Society, one gentleman proposed that Anne Bonny and Mary Read were likely figments of sailor folklore, given feminine qualities by rum-fueled imagination. Another published essay claimed their stories were moral metaphors, meant to warn against vanity and unladylike conduct. One particularly prim historian simply refused to acknowledge them at all, calling such tales crude disruptions of naval decorum. Yet the records refused to cooperate. Court transcripts, shipping manifests, colonial letters, all spoke of women who had not only sailed but led, fought, and terrified. So the academic narrative began to bend. By the late 1800s, more adventurous historians started to include female pirates in their collections of maritime history. Not front and centre, of course, not yet, but in the margins. A footnote here, a curious anecdote there, always with caution, always with a wink. One such collector, Captain Charles Johnson, likely a pseudonym, published a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates in the 1720s, a book reprinted and revisited countless times over the following century. Though its facts were often embroidered, its inclusion of Anne Bonny and Mary Read kept their names alive in the bloodstream of legend. Still, the tone of these retellings was rarely respectful. Most accounts reduced the women to caricatures, fiery redheads with heaving bosoms and suspiciously clean pistols. They were described not as complex figures, but as exotic novelties, dangerously sexy, tamed by love or fate or a handsome rogue. In popular culture, female pirates became a subgenre of pulp fiction, usually illustrated in poses that defied both gravity and basic naval logic. Their weapons gleamed, their corsets strained. Their swords were symbols less of rebellion and more of forbidden fantasy. But history is patient. By the early 20th century, a new wave of scholars, many of them women, began to ask different questions. What were the conditions that allowed these women to sail? What were the systemic forces that tried to erase them? And most importantly, what do their stories reveal not about piracy, but about power? One such trailblazer was Lucy Gordon, a maritime historian who, in 1928, published Salt and Sorrow, The Hidden Histories of Seafaring Women. In it she dissected not just the legends, but the records, the shipping lists, the court testimony, the church logs. Her work confirmed what generations had half suspected. Women didn't just sail, they ruled, rebelled, and bled just like the men. Often more. Lucy's work was initially dismissed as sentimental feminism, but quietly, steadily, it changed the tide. Universities began offering courses in gendered maritime history. Documentaries traced the real paths of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Archaeologists began to search shipwrecks not just for cannonballs and doubloons, but for the faint clues of a woman's life. Hairpins tucked in a boot, a blade engraved with initials, a rib cage that didn't fit the mould. Meanwhile, pirate museums began redesigning exhibits. The female mannequins, once limited to wenches and damsels, were suddenly brandishing weapons and staring you down across the display case. Children's books added chapters, television shows tested new characters, and slowly the Pirate Queen emerged, not as fiction, but as fact reframed. And yet, even as history reclaimed these figures, it had to wrestle with the lingering discomfort they caused. Because female pirates don't fit easily into the frameworks of hero or villain. They blur lines, they defy explanations. Take Anne Bonny. Is she a feminist icon? A criminal? A lost soul? A survivor? Or perhaps all of these, tangled together like ropes in a storm? Modern scholars continue to debate her legacy. Some paint her as a proto-revolutionary, striking against a world that offered her nothing. Others caution against romanticizing her too much. She killed, she stole, she burned ships. She wasn't a folk hero, she was a pirate. And that's the beauty of it. She wasn't perfect. Neither was Mary Read, or Jeanne de Clisson, or any of the others now surfacing from the archives. They were human, complicated, brave, flawed, which makes them infinitely more interesting than the sanitized legends that once tried to tame them. Today, the academic world still probes their stories for meaning. University papers dissect trial language. Geneticists study buried remains. Artists reinterpret their likenesses. Less cleavage, more scars. Less mascara, more muscle. And in classrooms, students debate what piracy really meant. Was it lawlessness, or just a refusal to play by rigged rules? Anne Bonny has appeared in dissertations, reenactments, comic books, and even courtroom dramas. Mary Read's name has been invoked by gender theorists exploring performativity and power. Pirate-themed festivals now routinely feature panels on the women who ruled the waves, where historians, cosplayers, and curious locals share notes and stories under the same sun that once bleached the decks of real pirate ships. There's even a growing call to digitize and republish trial transcripts involving female pirates, so that the world can see their words firsthand, stripped of corset-bound reinterpretation. Because their voices still echo, in the ink of a confession, in the silence of a verdict, in the way a scholar tilts her head at a smudged signature and wonders, who was she really? And more importantly, who gets to tell her story? So while the world once tried to bury these women in polite silence and pirate clichés, the tides have turned. Today, their lives are being re-examined with the depth they deserve, not as accessories to someone else's myth, but as architects of their own. The sea may not have given them back in full, but the archives are learning to listen. Carefully, reverently, and with just enough salt to honour the truth. The sea is a stage for myth as much as for reality, and when women stepped upon it wielding weapons instead of wailing, the world struggled to explain them. Some were dismissed as anomalies, others, far more intriguingly, were called witches. The sea witch narrative isn't just superstition, it's a pattern carved deep into the colonial psyche. Female pirates, already disconcerting for their physical presence on deck, became even more disturbing when they survived storms that sank stronger ships, fought with uncanny skill, or escaped capture in ways the courts couldn't explain. So, predictably, the world turned to the oldest excuse it had: magic. It sounds dramatic, but in the 17th and 18th centuries the line between heretic, rebel and sorceress was paper thin, especially for women, and on the sea, that fear intensified. The ocean was untamable, unpredictable, a realm of monsters and miracles. Add a woman to the helm of a pirate ship, and suddenly the explanation wasn't strategy or cunning, it was spellcraft. In 1699, a woman named Isabel Malve was captured near St. Vincent. Her ship had evaded 3 Royal Navy vessels, vanished for weeks, then reappeared in a cove with its hold mysteriously full and no casualties. When questioned, her crew refused to speak. Isabel herself remained silent except to ask for rum. Rumours spread quickly. She had summoned winds. She had cursed the Navy ships with bad powder. Her ship was said to travel faster at night than by day. There was no trial, just a quiet execution. No record of a last word, no sermon. One line in a naval ledger notes simply, "Witch, Hungarian." Do not record further. It wasn't a legal category, it was a burial. Another case involves a woman named Eda Mollen, known in the Caribbean as the Raven. Her ship, the Morning Cloak, was said to fly no flag, appear out of nowhere, and vanish before it could be pursued. Survivors claimed she spoke to the sea in a foreign tongue, that her eyes changed colour in battle, that she drank ink. Wild? Absolutely. But what matters isn't whether these things were true, it's that they were believed. Eda, when finally caught, was placed in irons and transported to a holding cell in Curaçao. Before her trial, a fire broke out in the prison, killing 11. Eda was never found among the dead. Some say she started it. Others say she vanished into smoke, her laugh echoing down the corridors. Again, real or fiction? Historians still argue whether Eda ever existed. Some believe she's an amalgam of several pirates. Others say she was invented by rival crews to explain their failures. But whether she lived or not, the legend clung like seaweed. This witch framing was not always overt. Sometimes it lurked in descriptions. Unnatural woman. Possessed by fury. Not given to tears. In one trial, a judge referred to a female pirate as having the gaze of Lilith and the tongue of Leviathan. A poetic way of saying she scared him. Women who defied gender roles, especially violently, were often explained in religious or supernatural terms. Not just pirates, but soldiers, duelists, spies. Their competence was threatening. Their autonomy, heresy. And the sea, always symbolic, became their metaphorical cauldron. There are even records of ships believed to be cursed because a woman had once served aboard. In one instance, a merchant captain refused to take on a sailor rumoured to have been in the crew of a witch ship. When asked why, he reportedly muttered, "The salt still burns in her wake." Women aboard ships had long been considered bad luck, a superstition sailors clung to with alarming seriousness. A woman was thought to anger the sea gods, to bring storms, but paradoxically they were also seen as good omens if they were figureheads. Painted on the prow, bare-breasted, eternally silent. Passive symbols of luck were fine. Living, breathing, swearing ones, not so much. So when women not only joined pirate crews but succeeded, when they returned from storms or battles unscathed, people reached for supernatural explanations. It was easier than admitting that they had been bested. One particularly strange belief held that some female pirates wore rings carved from whale teeth or black coral to protect themselves from drowning. These objects, while common in island markets, were often ascribed magical properties when found on women. One ship's log describes confiscating a charm ring, obsidian, belonging to the Lady Corsair, confiscated and cast into the sea. The writer adds, the waves grew calm thereafter. Coincidence, perhaps, or the power of narrative doing its job. Yet the witch label wasn't just a curse, it was a tool. Some female pirates leaned into the fear. They cultivated the myth to protect themselves. A letter from 1720, written by a merchant captain who survived a boarding raid, recalls the pirate leader, a woman he calls Mistress Shade, as never raising her voice but compelling obedience with a look. She carried no sword, he writes, yet no one crossed her. When she spoke, it was as if the air leaned closer. Could be metaphor, could be memory twisting under trauma, could be something more. In any case, the sea witch persona served two purposes. It dehumanized the woman, making her seem monstrous, and it elevated her, granting her a fearsome mystique. She became more than pirate, she became legend. This duality has persisted into modern portrayals. In novels, films and games, the female pirate often straddles the line between rebel and sorceress. She's not just cunning, she's preternatural, not just brave, otherworldly. The old tropes linger. The wind answers her call, compasses break in her presence, men falter under her gaze. We still use magic to explain her strength. Why? Perhaps because power, when held by a woman outside the boundaries of society, still makes us uncomfortable. And framing that power as mystical, rather than earned, offers a palatable detour. This isn't to say that real pirate women believe themselves witches. There's no record of spell casting, cauldrons or rituals. No manifestos penned under moonlight. What existed were smart, dangerous women operating in a world that had no slot for them, and the world in return labelled them with the only vocabulary it had for fear and awe. In a way, calling them witches was an accidental compliment. It acknowledged their agency, it admitted their impact. It proved, without quite meaning to, that they mattered. Because you don't call someone a witch unless they've scared you. You don't burn stories unless they spark something. And centuries later, the embers of those stories still glow. In every mention of a ghost ship crewed by women, in every storm that some sailor blames on bad luck, and one forgotten name, in every museum that still hesitates before adding a woman's face to a wall of pirate kings. So next time you hear thunder crack over the sea, think of them, not cloaked in smoke and spells, but in grit and gunpowder, not witches, just women, too skilled to kill, too dangerous to name, too real to forget. The final candle flickers in a windless room. Somewhere far from courtrooms and shipwrecks, a bundle of parchment rests in a drawer no one's opened in decades. Not because it was lost, but because someone once decided it was safer left unread. Inside, the last words of women who once ruled the waves and who, at the end, had only ink to fight with. Confessions, letters, journal fragments. Not many survive. Paper, after all, doesn't fare well at sea, and in prison, even less. But what does remain, though brittle, browned, and sometimes charred, feels like breath from beyond the grave. One of the oldest known pirate confessions from a woman is a slanted, water-stained letter, allegedly written by Mary Read during her final days in prison. Whether the hand is hers has been debated, but the words resonate. I lived brave, and now I wait quiet, not in fear, but in stillness. The sea, I think, will come find me even here. It's not a grand confession. It doesn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, it feels like resignation, but with dignity. There's no apology for piracy, just a sort of knowing calm, a readiness. This theme appears in other writings too, that their choices were deliberate, that the sea offered them something the land never did. Space, voice, motion. In 1733, a captured pirate named Anne Durrell was held in a damp jail cell in Granada. She scratched lines into the walls with a shard of tin, some of which were copied by a priest before the jail was demolished. They will write lies about me. Let them. I wrote my name in salt and smoke. And she wasn't wrong. The pamphlets that followed her death did exactly that, recasting her as a temptress, a thief of virtue, a warning to decent girls. But the truth, that salt and smoke truth etched in iron and stone, is harder to erase. Other last words take stranger shapes. There's a preserved letter from 1706 folded neatly inside a sailor's diary, signed only C. It reads, "To the boy who carried my blade, bury it by the black reef, where the gulls fly crooked. Tell no one what we were. Let the sea keep some secrets." The letter is real. The diary's provenance confirmed. Who C was, no one knows. But the voice rings sharp and real, part pirate, part poet, wholly free. And then there are the letters never meant for history. Tucked in the corners of archives and attics, found behind false drawers or sewn into jacket linings, they bear names forgotten by scholars but preserved by circumstance. One, written in careful French, is addressed to Mon Petit Charles. The author, a woman named Marguerite, describes life aboard a ship where the sky is both roof and judgment. She urges her son to grow into a man who can tell stories that don't leave women out. Another, found in an Irish family Bible, includes a prayer by a former pirate who begged for peace without penance. and the memory of cannon fire only as thunder. Historians still argue whether these documents belong in pirate lore at all. Some insist they're forgeries, others call them misattributed. But to read them is to feel the weight of lives lived in contradiction, bold, brutal, beautiful, and unspeakably lonely. And then there's the letter that's not a letter at all. Found inside a broken locket from a Port Royal excavation, there was a scrap of cloth inked with 3 words. I forgive him? No one knows who him was. A captain, a lover, a jailer, maybe even a father. The handwriting was rushed but steady. The ink faded but not lost. It is these small, intimate pieces, these last words, whether whispered or scratched, that undo the clean lines of pirate mythology. They aren't declarations of gold or glory. They aren't monologues delivered before cannon fire. They're soft, defiant, quietly furious. A journal discovered in an English estate contains a passage from a former housemaid who had briefly served a woman suspected of piracy. She would sit at the window when it rained, her boots always by the door. She never spoke of the sea, but when it thundered, she smiled. Is that memory, or metaphor, or both? The silence surrounding these women was often deliberate. Courts buried testimony. Families erased scandal. Pirates themselves rarely documented much. They were too busy surviving, but even in that era echoes remain. In the Museum of Maritime Letters in Lisbon, there is a display of coded notes, simple phrases that pirates used to signal safety or threat. One, translated from a cipher, reads, "I sail still. No sender, no recipient, just that." And maybe that's the purest last word a pirate could offer, because despite the ropes and records, the trials and traitors, many of these women ended their journeys in uncertainty. Their bones lie in unmarked graves or sunken ships, or perhaps not at all, cremated by the sun and salt. But their voices, they trickle through every scrawled confession that says, "I would do it again," through every carving in a cell wall that resists the damp, through every broken sentence that outlived its paper. Modern historians, of course, remain cautious. They weigh authenticity, cross-reference dates, question biases, and rightly so. Truth demands rigour, but sometimes, in the quiet of an archive, even the most sceptical scholar can feel the tremor of presence. A turn of phrase too intimate to fake, a detail too precise to dismiss. In those moments, the last words of pirate women are not just history, they're rebellion frozen in ink. They remind us that death did not end their stories. Silence did not win. Because here we are, centuries later, listening, and not just to what they said, but to what they chose to say last. The cannon has gone cold, the sails are folded, and the tide is pulled back, leaving behind not just broken mast and iron shot, but the people who stood at the shoreline, watching the sea swallow someone they loved. For every pirate hauled to the gallows, there was often someone left behind, a widow, a sister, a child, a lover. And while the courts passed sentence on the visible, history has long ignored the invisible network of women who lived in the aftermath of piracy. The pirate widow network, as some now call it. They weren't all married. Some were lovers, others were partners in crime, business associates, or family members caught in the splash zone of outlaw life. What connected them was not only loss, but the delicate, dangerous work of survival in the ruins of a life once lived just beyond the law. Let's start with the practical. When a pirate died, executed, shipwrecked, disappeared, their belongings didn't magically vanish. Someone came for the gear, the debts, the grudges, and often that someone was a woman who had shared their roof or their rum or their plans. In Bridgetown, there's a probate record from 1722 listing Mrs. Lydia Sprague as the sole inheritor of a condemned pirate's assets. It includes a pistol, one ivory comb, a compass etched with initials, and a sealed letter that was never opened. The Crown allowed her to keep only the comb. The rest was confiscated as evidence of criminal enterprise, so she sued. Lydia, it turns out, wasn't just a grieving partner. She was sharp, literate, and furious. Her court filings claim she had no part in the late man's exploits, but every part in his return. She won back the pistol, lost the compass. The letter? Still sealed in the colonial archives because no one ever proved who it was from. Lydia is not unique. Across the Caribbean, widows and partners of pirates appeared in courtrooms to reclaim property, plead for leniency, or simply declare, "I knew him, but I was not him." Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. One unnamed woman, referenced only as wife to that French rogue who plagued Jamaica's coast, was forced into indentured servitude after her husband's capture. The court reasoned that while she had not committed piracy, she had benefited from plundered comforts, including a silver teapot and silk robes. Her children were taken to an orphanage. There's no record of what became of her. In Port Royal, the widow of a pirate known only as Hector opened a small apothecary near the docks. Locals whispered that she sold more than herbs, that her back room held charts, coded letters, and a shrine to the dead. But no charges were ever brought. She lived into her 60s. Her shop burned down in a fire, and some say a metal lockbox was recovered, containing a locket, 2 gold coins, and a map drawn in charcoal. No one could read it. The grief these women carried wasn't just personal, it was political. To be the partner of a pirate meant living under suspicion. Some towns barred such women from remarrying. Others forced them to relocate. Children were often labelled as illegitimate, regardless of actual marriage status, and denied inheritance. Churches hesitated to baptise them. Schools refused enrolment. And yet these women formed connections of their own. In the markets of Tortuga and the alleys of Nassau, they shared more than gossip. They warned each other when the navy was searching. They passed notes, bartered favours, built quiet alliances. One woman might offer safe lodging, another a false reference. A third might help with passage to another port. In letters intercepted by colonial officials, references appear to the net, an unconfirmed network of women who helped former pirates escape, hide, or rebuild. Most letters were unsigned, but the phrases repeated. Ask for vinegar. She'll bring wine. No light in the window means run. These codes, small as they seem, suggest a system, not just of sympathy but strategy. Some historians dismiss this as myth. Others argue that while no formal group existed, a cultural web did, woven not by hierarchy but by shared necessity. One fragment, scribbled in the margin of a court record, reads, "Widow says she saw the sea take him, but her smile says different. Was it grief, or the satisfaction of justice done by nature's hand?" And not all widows were victims. Some women picked up where their partners left off. In 1715, a woman named Ruth Carrigan reportedly took command of her late husband's smuggling network. She changed its focus from weapons to sugar and rum, operating under the cover of a church guild. Her ledgers, discovered in a hidden compartment of a church bell tower during restoration in the 1980s, revealed decades of transactions, some legal, some not. Her name appears only once. A small RC beside an entry for weathered spices and salt. Ruth was never arrested. She died, a grandmother, in her own bed. And then there are the women who avenged. A sailor's diary from 1740 describes a woman in Martinique who cornered a navy officer in a tavern and challenged him to a knife duel. She blamed him for her lover's hanging. He refused. She spat in his drink. The next day he was found with a slashed arm and a note pinned to his coat. He never begged. The diary doesn't name her, but the phrase, "he never begged," became graffiti near the docks for years afterward. Others coped more quietly. Some turned to religion. A former pirate's wife joined a convent, where she embroidered sails with verses. Another became a midwife, reportedly whispering sea shanties during labour to calm nervous mothers. One ran a bakery, shaping loaves like ships and never explaining why. They carried their grief like contraband, hidden but heavy. For the children, the legacy was murkier. Sons of pirates were sometimes pressed into navy service as punishment or redemption. Daughters were married off quickly, often to older men, to clean the bloodline. A few rebelled, running to see themselves, continuing the cycle. But some refused the shame. In the diary of a New England schoolteacher, she recounts meeting a girl who introduced herself proudly. "My mother knew the sea. My father kissed the gallows, and I'm not sorry." That girl later disappeared from the school records, and so the legacy of the pirate widow network is not carved in stone or engraved in brass plaques. It's in the stories half told, the warnings shared, the eyes that met across a market stall and said, without words, "I know what you lost." They were not pirates, but they bore piracy's shadow. Not criminals, but always suspect. Not heroes, not villains. Just women, survivors, strategists, mourners, and sometimes quiet revolutionaries. History tried to forget them, but they remembered each other. The rope didn't always tighten because of blood on a woman's hands. Sometimes it was her boots, her coat, her hair pulled back beneath a tri-corner hat. Sometimes The crime was not what she did, but how she looked doing it. In the courtrooms of the Caribbean and colonial America, female pirates weren't just judged for robbery or violence. They were judged for their appearance, for failing to be ladylike, for presenting themselves not as delicate, weeping victims, but as roughened, swaggering sailors. And those who crossed that visual line, those who dressed like men, often found themselves doomed by fabric before evidence. Historians call it costume and condemnation, the phenomenon where gender nonconformity, especially when paired with crime, was treated as a moral offence worse than the crime itself. Let's walk into a courtroom, say in Nassau, 1718. A woman stands before the magistrates. She's accused of piracy, yes, but more notably she's wearing trousers. Her hair is cropped, her stance is wide, her hands are calloused. The judge looks down from the bench. He doesn't just see a criminal, he sees a threat to order. Because back then, clothes were more than fashion. They were law. Sumptuary laws regulated who could wear what. Trousers were for men, petticoats for women, boots with brass buckles, only for the gallant, the military, or those performing masculinity with state approval. A woman dressing above her station was bad enough. A woman dressing as a man was rebellion in physical form, and a woman dressing as a man and committing violence, that was treason against the very structure of society. There's a court record from 1701 in which a judge declares, "The garb is more offensive than the blade." A pirate's sword could be taken, but her posture, her gait, her refusal to wilt, these the court could not tolerate. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, you'll remember, wore trousers and fought like men. In their trials, the testimonies lingered on their appearances. One witness claimed, "They bore themselves as though no difference of sex should humble them." Another said Mary shot straight and spat like a man though her bosom betrayed her. And it's hard not to notice the obsession with these physical details. Court scribes spent more ink describing what the women wore than what they did, and for many that clothing sealed their fate. A lesser-known pirate, Judith Flynn, was captured wearing a long coat, breeches and a belt of knives. She was immediately accused of not only piracy but masquerading to deceive the Lord's eyes. Her trial ended quickly. Her last request? To be buried in my proper boots. Contrast that with Margaret Leeds, who was caught in a similar raid but surrendered wearing a gown and bonnet. Her defence? That she'd been kidnapped and forced aboard. The court, noting her appearance, chose to believe her. She was pardoned and sent to a convent. Historians still debate whether she was telling the truth, or just dressing it. This double standard persisted in print media as well. Early broadsheets featured illustrations of pirate women that were wildly inconsistent. Some depicted them in armour, others in scandalous gowns with daggers strapped to their thighs. Few offered realism. What mattered was the message. Women who looked too masculine were dangerous, unnatural. Women who looked feminine but acted violently, bewitching, unstable, exotic. Neither category offered a way out. This obsession even reached the hangman's platform. A record from a 1724 execution notes the crowd murmuring at the bold manner in which the woman wore her coat. She stood tall, eyes forward, no petticoat, no shawl. One spectator wrote, "She looked more like a captain than the man beside her." There's an eerie symmetry in how these executions were framed. Male pirates were executed for their deeds. Female pirates? For their defiance, made visible by cloth and cut. And yet, some used that same scrutiny to their advantage. A woman named Liza Hart was captured near Barbados dressed fully as a man. At trial, she removed her coat, let down her hair, and wept. The court softened. She claimed coercion, feigned frailty, and asked for forgiveness. She walked free. A year later, she was spotted in Trinidad, back in boots and sword, sailing under the name Captain Hobb. Her manipulation of appearance wasn't just clever, it was strategic. She understood that in a world where women were judged by their clothing, the right hemline could be a weapon. Others never learned to play the part, or refused to. One court document describes a female pirate who refused to wear a gown in court. "They can hang me as I am," she said, and they did. Even today, this theme lingers in how we remember them. Film and fiction tend to romanticize the pirate queen look, corsets and daggers, red lips and flintlocks. But the real women often dressed for function, not flair. They needed mobility, protection, disguise. They wore boots because shoes would split on deck. They wore belts because they carried knives, flint, powder. They wore coats because weather didn't care about gender. and for this practicality they were often condemned. One museum display in Kingston features a pair of worn leather trousers attributed to a female pirate. The tag beneath reads, "Trousered Defiance." Tourists snap photos. But the real defiance was that she wore them knowing what they meant, not just in battle, but in court, in church, at the end of the rope. It's tempting to say that clothes don't matter, that they're just fabric. But for these women, they were evidence, identity, strategy, a form of expression that could, in a twisted way, either save them or sentence them. And this legacy echoes far beyond the 18th century. To this day, women are judged for dressing too masculine, too provocative, too severe. The court of public opinion still lingers on the hemline instead of the headline. Female authority still makes many bristle, especially when it arrives in boots. So when we look back at these pirates, let's not just admire the swordplay and scandal. Let's remember what it meant to fasten those buckles, to walk into a courtroom dressed not for mercy but for truth. They wore what they had to, what they chose to, what they meant to, and they paid for it, with their lives, their names, and sometimes their very place in history. But not anymore. Now, when we see those boots, we know what they stood for, and we're still standing. The sails are stitched with studio lights now. The compass clicks to the beat of CGI, and the cutlass. It's plastic, priced at $14.99, packaged for Halloween. The pirate, the one who once haunted merchant lanes and courtroom nightmares, has become an icon, a costume, a pop culture behemoth. And in that transformation, something strange has happened. The female pirate, once feared and erased, has re-emerged in sequins. Hollywood has made her glamorous. The corset laced tight, the hair impossibly clean, the smirk just enough to suggest mischief but not danger. From theme parks to fantasy novels, from toy aisles to streaming services, the modern female pirate is a staple, a symbol of rebellion wrapped in fishnets and flair. But how did we get here? Backtrack to the early 20th century. As mentioned earlier, scholars were just beginning to unearth the records of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read. But outside the ivory tower, pulp novels and magazine serials were already doing their own unearthing, only with a lot more cleavage. In those pages, pirate women weren't complex figures shaped by desperation or politics. They were vixens of the sea, seducing their enemies and stealing ships with a wink. These stories, often written by men for men, helped seed the image of the pirate queen as equal parts dagger and décolletage. Cinema followed suit. Silent films of the 1920s featured pirate damsels swinging from ropes and landing in the arms of clean-shaven swashbucklers. By the 1950s, Technicolor productions gave us characters like Anne of the Indies, a fictionalized pirate captain whose dialogue sparkled with defiance, even as her plotline funneled her into romantic tropes. It wasn't all bad. For many young viewers, these were the first on-screen women who did more than feint and flirt. They fought, they led, they got the treasure. But it came at a price. Their complexity was flattened, their rage turned to sass, their historical context vanished beneath eyeliner and clever quips. Even today, in blockbuster films, the female pirate often exists to balance a male lead. She's the unpredictable love interest, the not-like-other-girls figure who drinks rum and curses, but ultimately finds her purpose by choosing a side, or a man. Rarely does she sail alone, and rarely, if ever, does she hang. That's one of the biggest differences between the real stories and the modern myth. In reality, female pirates were caught, tried, imprisoned, executed. In fiction, they ride off into the sunset, or vanish into the mist, or settle down with their sword sheathed permanently. It's not that we want more gallows, but the erasure of consequences changes the narrative. It makes piracy seem glamorous, a stage for self-expression rather than a life defined by risk, violence, and mortality. Still, in the last 2 decades, something has shifted again. A new generation of storytellers, many of them women, have begun to reclaim the pirate narrative with fresh eyes. Novels like Daughter of the Pirate King and shows like Black Sails introduce female pirates as full characters, not just set dressing. They're flawed, strategic, driven. They face real stakes. They bleed. In classrooms, students debate Anne Bonny not as a sexy outlaw, but as a figure of resistance against gender norms. In costume design, creators mix leather and linen with historical realism. The cleavage is still there, but so are the bruises. Even Halloween, that most commercial of holidays, has started to diversify its pirate offerings. Yes, you'll still find Sexy Buccaneer and Siren of the Seven Seas, but alongside them now, Captain Quinn, a gender-neutral ensemble with practical boots and an eye patch that actually fits. Children's books now feature pirate girls who aren't scolded for being loud or bossy or brave. They command ships made of cardboard, hoist sails from blankets, and plot maps in crayon, and no one tells them to stay on shore. There's even a burgeoning interest in historical cosplay, where reenactors, some of them trained historians, portray real female pirates at festivals and museums. They recite actual trial transcripts. They teach swordplay. They remind audiences that the past was not just corsets and candles, but also grit and defiance. It's not all progress. The internet still floods with pin-up pirates. Social media filters still turn pirate makeup into smoky eyes and windblown hair. And most Halloween costumes for women still emphasise curves over cutlasses. But here's the twist. Many women wear those costumes with full knowledge of the history. They know the real Anne Bonny would have scoffed at heels. They wear the fishnets anyway, not out of ignorance, but as a remix, a celebration of how far we've come from the noose. Because the modern obsession with female pirates isn't just about fantasy, it's about reclamation. For centuries, these women were erased or demonised. Now they're being imagined back into the story, not always accurately, but with increasing nuance. They're symbols of rebellion, yes, but also of possibility, of women who didn't wait for permission, who crossed lines, who broke laws not just to steal, but to breathe. And isn't that the essence of piracy? Not just theft, but transformation. A rejection of the rules, a decision to chart your own course, even if the sea is rough and the map is blank. In that sense, every Halloween costume, every classroom essay, every pirate-themed birthday party with a girl swinging a foam sword is part of a strange, beautiful continuum, from gallows to gift shops, from shackles to streaming, from courtroom silence to fandom shout-outs. The modern female pirate is not the real thing, but she's a signal, a wink, a whisper in the wind that says, "You forgot about us once, not again." The waves don't keep records. They hold no grudges, draw no lines between hero and villain. They crash, swallow, and smooth. And somewhere beneath those rolling crests lie bones that were never named, stories that were never told, verdicts that were never truly settled. This final chapter is for them, the silent ones. The ones who did not make it into trial records, who left no confessions, who never wrote letters or wore the kinds of clothes historians could frame behind glass. These were the female pirates who disappeared not into exile or reinvention, but into the deep, into shallow graves and unmarked corners of the world. Today, forensic science attempts to retrieve what memory forgot. In archaeological digs from Jamaica to Nova Scotia, fragments have been recovered from wrecks long assumed to hold only men, jawbones with delicate dental patterns, pelvic structures revealing female anatomy, traces of fabric not typically issued to male sailors. At one shipwreck site off the coast of Hispaniola, a single gold earring was discovered in what was believed to be a mess crew's sleeping quarters. Nothing extravagant, no emeralds, no ornamentation. Just a simple hoop, worn smooth. Nearby, a rusted belt buckle and the hilt of a blade with initials carved so faint they seem accidental. One initial may be M. The rest is lost. Could it have belonged to Mary Read? Unlikely. Could it have belonged to someone like her? Very possible. Forensic anthropologists caution us not to over-romanticize these finds. Human remains degrade quickly in salt water. Bones drift. Ships rot unevenly. And DNA, when extracted, tells only so much. Still, some mysteries nudge closer to clarity. In 2011, a partial skeleton was found in a shallow grave near the ruins of a prison outside Port Royal. The records list no burial that day. The grave was unmarked, but the body had healed fractures, ribs, collarbone and forearm, all injuries common in combat or shipboard labour. Most notably, the skull bore signs of blunt trauma, healed but lopsided, and the pelvis was unquestionably female. Her teeth had been filed, a common if painful practice among certain African and Caribbean seafarers, a sign of initiation or sometimes resistance. No name, no age. Just an index card now in a climate-controlled drawer. Unidentified female circa 1700 to 1725. Pirate associations possible. That possible is doing a lot of work. In Cape Verde, a dive team recovered a series of small pewter charms from a shipwreck, one shaped like a serpent wrapped around a cutlass. It matched an identical carving found in a colonial jail cell half a world away. Were these personal symbols, crew emblems, feminine versions of pirate tattoos? No one knows for sure. But their presence hints at continuity, at community, at something more deliberate than coincidence. And yet, for all this evidence, scattered, fragmented, eerily beautiful, there is still no confirmed grave of Anne Bonny, no final resting place for Mary Read, no headstone that reads, "Here lies a pirate who lived loudly and died with her boots on." It's not just that the sea swallowed them, it's that history didn't care to mark them, until now. In recent years, scholars have begun revisiting graveyards, using LiDAR scanning and radar tools to identify disturbed ground where unofficial burials may have taken place. In several colonial cemeteries, female remains have been exhumed and examined, revealing muscular wear patterns and healed injuries inconsistent with domestic life. One woman, buried beneath a field in South Carolina, had shoulders warped from repetitive heavy lifting, wrists marked by binding scars, and an iron ring fused to her femur. No marriage records, no birth records, just a small wooden plaque nearby, too faded to read. They called her the Ghost of Steed's Field, assuming she once sailed with the notorious Steed Bonny. No proof, just a hunch. But it caught on. Visitors leave seashells and toy ships by her grave. It's a poetic gesture, but it's also a question. How many women like her never got to tell their stories? How many were absorbed into soil and salt only to be remembered in fragments? The truth is, bones don't talk. But the context around them does. We know from letters and court documents that women were aboard ships. We know from uniforms altered in peculiar ways, from journal entries puzzled by unusual gait or soft voice. We know from rumours passed through generations, sharpened into legend, and now we know from the ground beneath our feet. Yet with all this knowledge, the ultimate question remains unanswered. How many female pirates have we lost completely? Historians estimate that women made up a tiny fraction of Golden Age pirate crews, perhaps 1% to 2%. But even that small number could mean dozens, if not hundreds, of women who lived and died outside the record. They didn't all fight for treasure. Some fought to escape violence, others for the thrill. Some followed lovers, some led them, some sailed to find freedom, some simply because it was the only way they knew how to survive. And when they were caught, some were tried, some were pardoned, some were erased, but many just vanished. The sea is good at that. So we turn to the silence, the gaps, the anomalies, the corroded trinkets and sealed archives. We read the spaces between what was said. We give weight to the shadows. And in doing so, we begin to reclaim not just their legends, but their humanity. Because history, after all, isn't just the stories that were told. It's the stories that were silenced, suppressed, ignored. And those bones, unnamed and quiet, are speaking now, not in words, but in weight, in proximity, in resistance. Their lives may never be fully reconstructed, but they are no longer invisible. We see them now. We hear them in the echoes of chains and sea spray, in the soft thud of boots on deck, in the hush that falls when a grave yields something unexpected, and in the long winding hush of history realizing it left too much unsaid. So here we are, dear night traveller, at the end of a long voyage, one stitched from salt, smoke and silence. We followed cannon fire into courtroom whispers, traced ink through iron bars, and watched figures vanish into mist and myth alike. We learned that female pirates weren't just anomalies. They were architects of their own stories, rebels not only against kingdoms, but against invisibility. They fought with blades, with wit, with deception, and with sheer refusal. And though history tried to bury them under silence and shame, their stories still pulse like tide beneath the moonlight. Some swung from ropes, others slipped into the crowd, some turned state's evidence, some died unnamed in jails. Some perhaps are still out there, in story, in symbol, in the quiet way we now look twice at a weathered pair of boots, or a name etched faintly on a cell wall. And now you know. You've carried their stories into the night, just as they once carried themselves across oceans that wanted to break them. You've heard their laughter echo off courtroom walls, their last words carved in tin, their freedom rewritten in fiction, fandom and forensic fragments. So let that hush fall, let the sea grow still. They were here, they mattered. And you, quiet listener, you remember. Sleep well.